The negotiations with Lukashenko are extraordinary, quite extraordinary, because Lukashenko is a small-time player in the Kremlin group. Lukashenko is a small poodle. However, there was a vacuum in the Kremlin because Mr. Putin wasn't there. Although he made his television appearance, he simply wasn't there to take decisions. He had already fled. Now, the Kremlin will do whatever it can to change that narrative, just as the Kremlin almost certainly is going to do everything it can to destroy the narrative put forward by Prigozhin that the war was not against NATO, that NATO had not started that war, and that there were no Nazi sympathizers in Ukraine of significance. So the idea that the Kremlin had built up was in Russia, particularly in the domestic audience, was that this was an anti-Nazi war. This was a revival of the patriotic war, the Second World War, against the Nazis, and that this was a war against the threat of NATO. These two things had been squashed by Prigozhin. They're going to undoubtedly be revived. We're going to see a huge amount of propaganda over the next few days, I think. Equally, Prigozhin's statement that the president is deeply mistaken, that of course strikes at the heart of the infallibility of Putin. Putin is now fallible. Putin is now seriously damaged by one of his own. But there's other things that come from the failed coup which equally make very little sense and are going to have to be addressed if the Kremlin is going to recover in any serious way, because it is badly damaged. The first one is that the idea that there was already a plan to turn aside, which is what Prigozhin said. He said, we're going to retreat to the field camps according to the plan. That plan didn't exist. Certainly, my friends in Rostov had no inkling of a plan, and the stories of the Wagner brigade getting ready to move into action, those Wagner members who were already in Moscow, the first convoy which was already approaching Moscow. It seems it was the convoy that Prigozhin was in, which was about 30 miles away from Moscow, which was the one that turned aside. The FSB, which was all that was left in Moscow, I mean, very few troops to defend Moscow, were already digging up the road. The idea that this was a battle that could not be won is nonsensical. Prigozhin and his brigade could just have walked into Moscow. Why didn't they? To retreat to the field camps according to the plan. And so that's one idea, that there was never any intention to get into Moscow. That doesn't make sense. And the other idea that Prigozhin said was his march must be stopped because there was now a possibility that bloodshed was possible. Again, that's nonsensical, because bloodshed had already taken place. 13 Russian soldiers had already died in helicopters. So the idea that there was a point at which bloodshed was possible, or bloodshed might take place, oh dear, we don't want bloodshed. The Wagner troops are already responsible for bloodshed. They already have blood on their hands. And they had already crossed the Rubicon. They had already defied tradition and moved in onto the home forces. So I don't quite understand. The narrative makes no sense, and Prigozhin has disappeared completely. And Putin is keeping a low profile. I'm sure we're going to see a lot of things over the next few days, but Shoigu's reappearance is a significant. And Shoigu isn't going to go anywhere soon. And I'm sure where we've seen Shoigu, we will shortly see Gerasimov, just to confirm that the military order is in place, that military order that isn't very good, really. And could this all have been a great ruse to distract from the Ukraine's attempt at counter offensive? I think Ukraine is doing surprisingly well, and I think it will continue to do surprisingly well against the odds. Ukraine is the smaller country. Ukraine is the country that has been attacked. Ukraine is already partly invaded. But this nonsensical coup can only give a dynamic to Ukraine's counteroffensive, can only be a positive for Ukraine. The fact that Prigozhin has not seized power is a positive for everybody. But what happens next is an unknown, because Putin has been weakened in a dramatic way.